There are some things that just don't happen in anime. No one survives getting hit by a truck. The incel NEET who yells at his mother for dinner and has given up on life never gets a second chance in the real world. And the character whose backstory just got shown while they're fighting against the main bad guy doesn't make it to the end of the story. There's also some things that rarely happen in anime. The main character finally realizing that the girl who screams every time she sees him actually has a crush on him. All of your favorite characters making it to the end of the story. And maybe the rarest out of all of these things is the characters in anime having good father figures. Because while, don't get it wrong, there are great fathers in anime, like Bocchi's dad and Isshin Kurosaki, a father figure A being around at all, and B, if they're around, actually being a good father to the characters in the anime you're watching, is about as rare as a four-leafed clover. Now, could this be a system of the fact that a lot of mangakos are probably raised in traditionally Japanese homes that didn't want them to pursue a career in art? Maybe, and thus the pursuance of that career in art made the mangaka bump head to head with their father who wanted them to do something more traditional, like being a salaryman or a doctor or a lawyer? Also maybe, but regardless of how it came to be, there is a lot more bad dads in anime than there is good. And thus bad dads in anime is one of the biggest talking points revolving around all anime circles. Whether you're an FMAB fan, a Neon Genesis fan, a Code Geass fan, or even a Dragon Ball Z fan, bad dads are something we can all relate to, at least in anime. And thus one of the most hotly debated topics in the entirety of the anime community is, who is the worst anime father? And while talking about who is the worst anime father is a bit less concrete than trying to decide who punches the hardest, there are definitely some dads in anime who are simply just worse than others. Which is why today we're going to be walking the tightrope of trying to rank and explain all the worst fathers in anime, until eventually we're able to come to a conclusive answer of who the true worst father in anime is, based on the incredibly complex and computational model that I built of, ooh, wouldn't want that to be my dad. And as somebody who's never met his biological father and whose adopted father was a schizophrenic pastor, trust me when I say, this computational model is well tested. So without further ado, let's get into ranking and explaining the worst fathers in anime. But before we get my expert opinion on terrible fathers, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me talking all things anime and manga, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you want to look like you keep up with all things anime and manga, go ahead and meander on over into my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. So, before we get into the most hotly anticipated ranked and explained we've ever done, we gotta set some ground rules and do a couple of honorable mentions. Listen, like I've already established, there's a lot of really bad dads in anime and manga, and today we're gonna be talking about 10 of those really bad anime dads. Now, if I had the time, the effort, or the will to make this list 20 or 30 entries, I absolutely could, with the sheer amount of terrible anime fathers there is to list from. However, once you get outside the realm of 10 bad anime dads, you start to nitpick on what could truly be considered a bad dad. Also, you start to wade into the territory of, oh, this person is irrelevant to the story. And thus, before I even get to my honorable mentions, I do want to bring up two bad dads who I believe are awful at what they do, and that is fathering, but also aren't important enough to their respective stories to truly be mentioned within the confines of a top 10 list. And those two fathers are almost the exact same person, because the two fathers that I believe would deserve a high spot on this list but aren't relevant enough to talk about are Kawaki's father and Gyro's father from Boruto and Hunter x Hunter. These two fathers are the exact same person, an alcoholic who ended up having a child they didn't want, with no mother in the equation. And thus both of these fathers forced their children to go out at an incredibly young age and work. And all of the money that they gain from this work that they're doing as a child, the father will mooch off and spend on booze, not on their kid. Whether it's food, housing, health, or an education, the father will not take a second out of their day to spend any of the money they could be spending on booze on that for their child. And technically, if you're gonna put these two fathers in a head-to-head to see who was worse, I'd actually have to give the edge to Kawaki's father. See, because while Gyro gets revenge on his father and ends up killing him for how he treated him all those years, Kawaki doesn't get revenge. He just gets abused and used by his father until eventually he's sold to Jigen. But both of these characters are side characters, and thus placing them in a head-to-head against some of the big hitters we have on this list didn't feel necessarily right. But bad dudes don't do that. Yes, children can work, and yes, that money can buy you booze. But we have laws against that. We didn't always, what we do now. Though if you really break it down, it's like a real life XP farm in Minecraft, children. At least it was until we couldn't send them to the mines anymore. Liberals, man. So whether or not you want to count those two as an honorable mention, that's up to you. Also, I don't know if honorable mention is really the best wording. So let's get to our first official dishonorable mention, and that would go to none other than Gendo Ikari. For those of you whose birthday year doesn't start with a 19, Gendo Ikari is from Neon Genesis Evangelion, and this man loves his wife, which I know might make him sound like an incredible father. But no. See, while Gendo loves his wife, he hates his son. But then again, I also kind of hate his son, and also kind of love at least the copy of his wife he made. So at the end of the day, the reason he's an honorable mention and not in the actual list is because he might have been right. Gendo is very openly cold to Shinji, and this is displayed over and over and over again. Because in one of the 20 times that Shinji is incredibly hysterical during Neon Genesis's run, he asks for his father to embrace him, at which point Gendo just turns around and walks away. Not to mention the fact that Shinji really doesn't want to get in the Eva, and Gendo really forces him to get into the Eva over and over and over again. And then eventually it's revealed that the only reason Gendo invited Shinji back into his life is because he was trying to get his wife back. So yeah, bad guy, great scientist, but also annoying son.
Oh, but Nick, Shinji's supposed to be the personification of anxiety. He's supposed to put a spin on the traditional mech MC. And then when he does that to Asuka, it's supposed to symbolize him hitting rock bottom.
I still don't like him. So for doing what I probably would have done, Gendo doesn't get to make the list. But you know who does get to make the list? Coming in at number 10, Charles V. Britannia. For those of you who aren't massive Pizza Hut fans, Charles V. Britannia is Lelouch's father from Code Geass. And it is hip as hell to say that Charles V. Britannia is one of the worst anime fathers out there. And listen, he's not a good dad, but he's also not as bad a father as a lot of the people on this list. Because while Charles V. Britannia is a bad father, he's more so just a bad guy. And I think that's where people get things confused. See, because while yes, did he technically sell Lelouch to the Nanali in Japan to be a worker for the rest of his life because Lelouch asked him why he didn't defend his little sister? And yeah, does he have over 108 children with 108 different women that he put in all different parts of the government so they could pit them against each other for his own entertainment? Yeah. But past 20 kids, how much can you really know or care about each and every single one of these children? And here's the thing. The real reason that Charles V. Britannia is having so many kids is one, because he's king, and two, because he doesn't believe in the standard human moral system. See, Charles V. Britannia believes in one thing and one thing alone, that deceit is evil. And thus he wants to take the entirety of humanity and smash them into the entirety of dead humanity to make a giant mega meatball hive mind. That is to say that Charles V. Britannia wants to kill God, what's referred to as the greater human unconsciousness. So yeah, if the guy who wants to eliminate individuality from all humans ends up being not so great a dad, how are we surprised about that? So was he a bad father? Yes, absolutely. But I think he's a bad father because he's the antagonist of the show. And as crazy as it sounds, selling your child to Japan where they can grow up to become a mech pilot and do so many great things is not nearly the worst place you could sell your child. And this list will show us that. I'm sorry, I was saying that he sold them to Nanali. Nanali is his sister who Charles shunned because she became paralyzed and blind. He sold Charles and Nanali to Japan as political hostages. Been a long time since I watched Code Geass, but it's been way less long since I watched the anime our number 9 spot is from, because coming up at number 9, we got Jing. And as I'm saying it out loud, Jing should have been our number 10 spot. Let's go ahead and shift Jing down 1. That one's on me. Because here's the thing. The thing that makes Jin Freaks a bad father is that he's not around, and he tries really hard to not be around. And it's really easy to not be around. My dad just moved to Reno, but Jing takes it a step beyond that. See, Jing possibly gets pregnant using the pregnancy stone in Greed Island, at which point he has a child, Gon, who's raised using the Pandamaid card also on Greed Island. And since we know that Gon visited Greed Island as a baby, it probably wasn't until Greed Island was completed that Jing decided to take Gon away from Greed Island, at which point he kind of just threw his baby at Auntie Mito and said, "Your problem now," and dipped. But don't worry, he left a save to an almost impossible to access video game. And a ring. And it was revealed that Jing basically made Greed Island to see if his child was worthy to ever meet him. And it's astounding that his child wanted to meet him in the first place because he didn't know him. But since Gon might literally just be a copy of Jing, Gon ending up as the strongest person on Whale Island who's fascinated with the world and hunters isn't all that crazy. But even when Gon does acquire a copy of the impossibly hard to get video game that his father made and beats said game, Jing writes in a rule that if Gon tries to bring a friend to their meeting, that he sends them to Kite. Why? Because apparently Gon needs to stand on his own, and this decision results in Gon going to the NGE, bumping into the Chimera Ants, realizing that Kite was an instrumental person in his life, and then watching Kite die, losing his humanity, losing his Nen, almost dying, coming back to life, and now having no Nen. But don't worry, now Gon gets to meet Jing on top of the hardest to climb thing on Earth. But surely Jing will stick around now that he's met his child. Right? Nope. Onto the Black Whale with his boyfriend Periston to go to the most dangerous place on Earth where he may never return from. Bye. It was nice. It was nice being traumatized to meet you. But speaking of being traumatized by father figures, coming up at number 8, we got Endeavor. See, not being around mental abuse, that's fine. That's low-level stuff. That's what gets you into the 9, 10s, and honorable mention spots. Not until you start hitting these kids do you get to go up the list a little bit. And boy, oh boy, did Endeavor have hitting kids in spades. See, the laws in the MHA world are kind of murky to us, the reader, but they're also kind of murky to the MHA world because quirks have only existed for about 100 years, and thus trying to figure out the legality revolving around these quirks is a difficult task. But what we do know is that quirks can't be activated in public unless you're a hero, and they also can't be used to hurt other people, kind of under the catch-all of assault. Now, one of the more nuanced rules that we know about the MHA world is that it's illegal to try and manufacture a special quirk baby. However, that's exactly what our boy NG, also known as Endeavor, tried to do. Because Endeavor, with his Hellfire quirk, wanted to find a wife who had an ice quirk, so he could create a child that had the fire and ice quirk. Unfortunately, he got it on the first. It took him 4 tries. And boy, oh boy, did he not care about those first 3 kids. And the lack of Endeavor caring about those 3 kids is why Toya, Endeavor's oldest son, who inherited his Hellfire quirk but his mother's physiology and therefore would burn his body when he used his flames, really didn't turn out so great, eventually becoming Dobby. But don't worry, eventually Endeavor did get the son he wanted, and he treated him like a kid. He abused him until eventually his quirks were strong enough to use in a way that Endeavor thought would finally surpass All Might's strength. Because when your entire life you're told you're number 2 and you don't think you can surpass All Might, what do? Psychologically break your wife with an abusive cycle of forcing her to have children until eventually she creates a baby that you like. You got that first try? That's so good job. Great job, even. And so Endeavor, when he finally got the son that he wanted, beat the idea of strength and success into said son. Meanwhile, the child who had stronger and hotter flames than Endeavor, Toya, was slowly but surely losing his mind, setting everything around him on fire. And you know who wasn't equipped to deal with that? His wife, and she slowly but surely began to lose her mind until eventually she threw hot water on Todoroki's face that would leave him with a scar forever, and then was hospitalized for this break. And what did Endeavor do to make up for all this stress that he induced on his wife? Nothing, at least for a while, but now he's trying to be a good dad again, and he's trying to not put too much pressure on Todoroki. He's trying to kill his oldest son, but he's also trying to reconnect with his 2 middle children. And because Endeavor is actually making an effort to try and be a somewhat good father nowadays, even though at one point in the story he was a really bad dad, unfortunately he's been kind of a good guy for a little while, and as to whether or not you want to forgive him, I know I personally never will, the fact that he's making an effort unfortunately does kind of knock him in the bad dad category. So he's gonna sit at number 8. But speaking of rekindling a relationship with a child you abused its entire life, coming up at number 7, we have Yuji Ranma, who is not only a bad father, but also just a bad person. Because while good old NG got at least verbal consent to make all those babies, Yuji Ranma doesn't. Which is how Yuji Ranma ended up having his first child, Jack Hanma, whose mother, let's just say he didn't buy dinner, okay? And then after not buying dinner, he left her alone and pregnant. And thus Jack Hanma grew up hating Yujiro Hanma, and thus he trained as hard as he possibly could, consumed steroids to make himself stronger, and had all of his limbs lengthened with an expensive and dangerous surgery so that he could take down Yujiro Hanma, which he super never does. Jack and Yujiro actually only ever fight in the original Baki the Grappler anime, where Yujiro very blatantly tells Jack that he's a disappointment to the Hanma name and then proceeds to bend him like a pretzel on the ground. And thus in this moment it's cemented in Yujiro's mind that Jack didn't get enough of his blood. But somehow Jack has it better off in terms of his relation with Dad than Baki, who Yujiro is actually interested in. So it's way worse for him. See, Baki came into being because one day Yujiro saw Emi, Baki's mother. Now, unfortunately for Emi's husband, she was married, so Yujiro killed him. He then proceeded to knock up Emi and leave, telling her to raise a strong and powerful child who could stand against him one day. And Emi does raise a strong kid. Baki grows up fighting everybody he can until eventually, at 13 years old, he's a menace to society. And it's at this point that Baki and Yujiro decide to face off, but only because Yujiro shows up in Baki's life, decapitates one of his friends, and then waves his head in front of Baki to go, hey, you want to fight me now? Mind you, he's doing this to provoke a 13-year-old to fight him. He then beats that child senseless, and when his mother, Emi, steps in to try and protect Baki, Yujiro kills her. Obviously filled with anger for the fact that Yujiro killed the one person in his life who was willing to raise him, Baki also, like Jack, commits himself to a life of training until eventually he's strong enough to fight against Yujiro. And time after time after time again, Yujiro bounces Baki's head off concrete walls, steel, and gates until eventually Baki is strong enough to stand toe-to-toe with his father. And in their final fight against each other, Yujiro hits Baki so hard he pees himself twice. However, Baki is eventually able to come to what is decided to be a draw between the two of them, but actually is a victory for Baki, though Baki can't hear it. And then after that, they're like, kind of friends, which is also why Yujiro's low on this list. Like almost the entirety of the last season of Baki Hanma, the most recent Baki IP we got, is Baki hanging out with Yujiro, being like, I want us to be father and son. I want us to have a regular father and son relationship so we can have a father and son fight. And then they have a father and son fight, and then they're like kind of cool with each other. But then again, this is a fight between a dude who smokes cigarettes in one pole and a guy who pretends to fight chimera dinosaur monsters in his mind to prepare to battle against the guy who smokes cigarettes in one pole. Expecting reason out of either of them is kind of ridiculous. And lack of reason is going to be something we talk about a lot today, because coming up at number 6, we have Judge Vinsmoke, who's really no different from Yujiro, because out the gate, Judge Vinsmoke cybernetically augmented the 5 children that his wife gave him. Not only make them strong, fast, and agile, but also to strip them of all emotions, because the only children he wanted were weapons. And when one of these children ended up not being a weapon, Sanji, he abandoned that child because he liked to cook and spend time with his sickly mother. And then when it was finally confirmed that Sanji just wasn't as strong as his other siblings, at least not yet, he had a helmet locked onto his head so nobody would know who he was, and then he was thrown into a hole, and then they threw away the hole. And if it wasn't for Reiju in an advantageous sea battle, Sanji would have spent the rest of his life in that cage. At least Yujiro gave Baki a chance to get strong. Judge was just gonna have a prisoner he was related to. But somehow that's not as bad as our number 5 spot, because coming up at number 5, we have Goku. Nick, what are you talking? Goku? He's not around, but he's not a bad father. Yes, he is. He's an awful father, an unrepentant sociopath who shouldn't be around children. And without Chi-Chi and Piccolo picking up the slack for Goku's absence, he could have raised 2 of the most dangerous entities in the entire universe. See, because here's the thing. Goku having children is a lot different than you or I having children, because Goku is having Saiyan children. And while the chances of your child becoming a serial killer are low, at least if your child becomes a serial killer, they'll be able to get 30, maybe 40 people before they're caught, max. If a Saiyan doesn't turn out right, millions? Billions? And Goku never once had a vested interest in making sure that his kids turned out correct. Because not only did Goku find every opportunity to die and abandon his family in the biggest sense of the word, even when Goku was alive, genuinely, how many times can you remember Goku ever having a conversation with Goten? Yeah, Goku's got 2 kids, one of which he doesn't even know he has. Not to mention, in order to get Gohan to live up to his potential in his battle against Cell, he gave an entity that had the ability to wipe out the entire planet they were all living on a senzu bean, because he wanted his child to fight in a fair fight against Cell, who none of them could beat. Don't even get me started on Super, like when Goku hires a hitman to come and kill him, and the hitman does the job, and then the entire family has to stumble upon his corpse, bring him back to life, just for Goku to wake up and be like, well, he's a hitman, he hasn't finished his job quite yet, I'm leaving now. So yeah, was he hitting the kids in any malicious way? No. Was he emotionally abusive? No. Does he have a much higher level of responsibility than any other father on this list? Absolutely. And the only father who even comes close to the level of responsibility that Goku had is our number 4 spot, because coming up at number 4, we have Rasa. See, Rasa is what could have happened if Goku was just a little bit worse of a father, because Rasa was the Kazekage of the Sand Village and realized that the Sand Village wasn't as powerful as he wanted it to be. And thus Rasa thought, I need to make the perfect weapon. And what better to make the perfect weapon with than your unborn child? So Rasa decided to seal Shukaku, the most violent and hateful out of all the tailed beasts, into his unborn child. Now obviously sealing Shukaku into Gaara before he was even alive ended up killing his mother in birth, but that's fine. She was just the only thing that ever would have cared about Gaara or that village in the first place. And now after you've sealed an incredible source of power that's tortured everybody it's ever been sealed into your infant, making sure that your child, for the rest of its life, if it ever falls asleep, will have that entity take over his body so that everybody in your village hates that perfect weapon you're trying to make. And thus, in the process of trying to make a perfect weapon that's supposed to make the Sand Village stronger, create something that's going to constantly destroy the Sand Village and destabilize it, all at the cost of your son's psyche. And don't worry, he won't make any friends to fix that psyche you broke. You know, of course, except for his uncle, who you send to kill him, knowing full well that it'll probably end up in his uncle's death. But don't worry, karma came back around to Rasa in the form of a genderless snake person. And speaking of animal people, coming up at number 3, we got Show Tucker. Listen, there's some people in this world who champion Show Tucker as a hero of science, a man dedicated to making one of the most beloved tropes in all of anime a reality. Animal girls. And as Show Tucker wasn't exactly too much of a ladies' man, he really couldn't get his hands on too many women. Fortunately for him, he had a wife and a daughter. So Show Tucker, in an attempt to keep his state alchemist license and prove that he's as good an alchemist as the rest in his ability to make a chimera that can speak, decides that instead of losing his alchemist license and getting, oh, I don't know, a regular job, or simply just doing alchemy without a license, that he would instead fuse his wife with an animal, making the first ever speaking chimera. You know, until obviously later in the show when we get introduced to a myriad of high-functioning speaking chimeras that the government secretly had. But since only making one speaking chimera didn't impress the government enough to not take his license away, Show had to double down and thus use the other person in his life, Nina Tucker, and her dog to make the second ever speaking chimera, at least so far as Show Tucker knew, committing his daughter to either essentially endless torture or death at the hands of Scar. But hey man, that's the hustle apparently. But is turning your daughter into a half-dog, half-human chimera as bad as selling one of your daughters to be violated by a pit of worms until eventually her mind breaks? I'm gonna say no. Which is why coming up at number 2, we have Tokiyomi Tosaka from Fate Stay Night, the best out of all of the Fate series. See, Tokiyomi Tosaka is the head of the Tosaka family, a family of incredibly powerful and important mages. And while he appears to be a suave, complicated, mysterious, and powerful mage, and Rin's father, one of the main characters, Rin Tosaka, red dress, pigtails, you get it, I've cosplayed her, Tokiyomi may be anything but the model citizen he appears to be. See, because Tokiyomi Tosaka had more than just one daughter. Obviously, the daughter that everybody remembers is Rin. She's one of the main characters of the show, but the second daughter he had was named Sakura Tosaka. But you now probably remember her as Sakura Mato. That's because Tokiyomi sold Sakura to her grandfather, the head of the Mato clan, as whatever daughter wasn't going to become the head of the Tosaka family was going to be experimented on by the Mages Association. Thus, he sent his youngest and less impressive mage daughter to her grandfather. And while it's argued as to whether or not Tokiyomi knew what was going to happen in the Mato household, or whether or not he knew how Mato mages got their bug magic in the first place, even if he didn't know, he should have. He literally married into the family. And what happened to Sakura changed her forever. It made her a hollow shell of who she used to be. For those of you who haven't seen Fate Stay Night, basically a child is thrown into a pit of bugs, and it's implied that the bugs get into the body however they can. And these bugs are large, and they're important in making the greatest Mages. It's like Fear Factor, but substantially worse, and you're a child. But because there's a possibility that Tokiomi didn't know that this was gonna happen to Sakura, we can't necessarily say he's the worst anime father of all time. No, because that special privilege goes to where else but a father from Berserk in Gambino. When it comes to worst anything, usually it ties back to Berserk in one way or another, and the worst father category is no exception to that rule. Because while in the beginning of Guts and Gambino's relationship, Gambino seems like a relatively good guy, adopting Guts off the streets and teaching him how to fight and allowing Guts to join his mercenary group, it doesn't stay that way forever. See, because while Gambino is rather rough with Guts in the times where he's trying to teach him how to fight, it's mostly because Gambino wants another strong fighter in his mercenary group. However, it does appear, at least to us who's experiencing this story through Guts' POV, that Gambino does at least care about Guts a little bit. However, things change after somebody who's really close to Gambino, Shisu, dies. And then pretty immediately after the death of Shisu, Gambino loses his leg protecting Guts. These two events massively spoil how Gambino feels about Guts, as Gambino's ideology shifts from Guts being a possible mercenary fighter who could stand by him one day to complete and utter resentment. So much resentment that eventually Gambino sells Guts' body to a fellow soldier by the name of Donovan for 3 silver pieces. Now mind you, at this moment in time, Guts is a child. And this is the first time in Guts' life that he's betrayed by somebody he believed cared for him. And if Guts had a nickel for every single time he was betrayed by somebody he thought cared about him, he'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird it happened twice. And this moment is not only incredibly jarring because it is a man essaying a child, but it's also incredibly jarring because we're experiencing this story through Guts' POV, and Guts genuinely believes that Gambino cares about him, and thus out of nowhere it's revealed that Gambino doesn't. Like, at all. And that's why earlier I said there's worse things than being sold to Japan as a political prisoner, because at least Lelouch didn't get the bug pit or the adult man. And with that, we have our definitive list of the worst fathers in anime. But I'm curious, who do you guys believe is the worst father in all of anime? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell.
Shinji, get in the Ava!